A medium banana has 422 milligrams of potassium. A medium baked potato with the skin on has 920. That gap has been sitting in plain sight in nutrition databases for decades. And the food sitting at the top of that list is one most people already have in their kitchen, just not for this reason. Potassium is not a background mineral. After 50, it is one of the primary variables determining how the heart's electrical system performs, how well blood pressure responds to the interventions most doctors recommend, and how much cardiovascular risk is accumulating beneath readings that look controlled on paper. It runs through every system that determines whether the next decade looks like decline or like function, and the body becomes measurably less efficient at holding on to it at precisely the moment when the cost of running low stops being theoretical. The problem is that the most widely repeated answer to the potassium question, eat a banana, was built on research from a moment when the comparison set was narrow and the population asking the question was younger. That answer was never wrong. It simply stopped being adequate without anyone formally updating the guidance. And the updated answer has been sitting on the same grocery store shelf the whole time. Priced lower, performing better, and almost never mentioned in the same sentence as potassium. What makes this harder to navigate is that the medications most commonly prescribed to Americans over 50 don't interact with potassium neutrally. Some push levels in one direction, others push them in the opposite one. Most people taking them have never had that explained in terms specific enough to act on. And the difference matters more than most clinical conversations allow time to address. There is also a reason why a body can pass every standard potassium test and still be running a meaningful deficit, and why that gap, invisible to routine blood work, quietly shapes outcomes in the heart, the bones, and the kidneys over years of accumulated shortfall. Which food actually delivers what a body over 50 needs? How much does preparation method change the outcome? And if the prescription you have been taking for years is quietly working against the mineral this entire conversation is about, what does that mean for everything else you have been doing right? Everything you need to know, starting now. And if this is the kind of conversation you want more of, subscribe and stay close. The banana has been the answer to the potassium question for so long that most people over 50 have never thought to ask whether it was actually the right one. Your doctor mentions it. The internet confirms it. The grocery store display practically announces it. And so the banana became the default answer to a question that, if you look closely, was never fully asked. The question isn't whether bananas contain potassium, they do. The question is whether bananas are the best way to get it, and whether the amount they provide is anywhere near what a body over 50 actually needs to function well. When you put the two questions on the table at the same time, the answer starts to look very different from what most people assume. Potassium is not a minor nutrient. It is one of the primary electrolytes your body depends on to regulate fluid balance, maintain normal blood pressure, support muscle contraction, and keep the electrical system of the heart running in a consistent rhythm. The kidneys use it constantly. The arteries respond to it directly. And the nervous system, which coordinates virtually everything your body does without conscious effort, relies on potassium to transmit signals accurately across billions of cells. According to the National Institutes of Health, the adequate intake for potassium in adults is 2,600 milligrams per day for women and 3,400 milligrams per day for men. A medium banana provides roughly 422 milligrams. That means a single banana covers somewhere between 12 and 16% of daily needs, which is meaningful but not transformative. To meet the full daily requirement from bananas alone, you would need to eat 7 or 8 of them every single day, which introduces its own complications in terms of sugar load and caloric intake. This is where the conversation usually stops. Someone mentions potassium, someone else says banana, and the exchange ends as though the question has been settled. But after 50, the stakes around potassium change in ways that make that kind of shorthand genuinely inadequate. The body becomes less efficient at maintaining electrolyte balance. Certain medications, among the most commonly prescribed in this age group, actively deplete potassium levels as a side effect. And the consequences of running chronically low are not subtle discomforts. They are measurable risks to cardiovascular function, bone integrity, and kidney health that accumulate quietly over months and years. What this video is about is not the banana. The banana is the starting point. The familiar reference that makes it easy to see how far the real answer actually sits from what most people believe. What this video is about is the mineral itself, how it works inside a body that has been alive for 50 or 60 years, and which food actually delivers it in a form and quantity that makes a meaningful difference. That food is not what you think it is, and by the end of this conversation, you will understand exactly why and what to do about it. There is a number that most Americans over 50 have never seen on a lab report, and it is one of the most telling indicators of cardiovascular and metabolic health available. Not cholesterol, not blood pressure, not fasting glucose. The number is serum potassium, and the reason most people have never thought to ask about it is that it tends to stay within a normal range even when the body is running significantly below optimal levels for extended periods of time. This is the central problem with potassium deficiency after 50. It is not dramatic. It does not announce itself with a clear, identifiable symptom that sends someone to a doctor. It accumulates slowly, expressing itself in ways that are routinely attributed to aging, stress, or a long work week. Muscle cramps that come and go, fatigue that persists past a full night of sleep, a heartbeat that occasionally feels irregular without any obvious cause, blood pressure readings that keep creeping upward despite reasonable effort to control them. None of these feel like a mineral deficiency. All of them can be. The American Heart Association has noted that inadequate potassium intake is associated with increased risk of hypertension, cardiovascular disease, and stroke, and that a large proportion of the American population consistently falls short of recommended intake levels. The gap is not marginal. Studies have found that average potassium consumption in American adults is roughly half of the recommended daily amount, meaning that deficiency is not an edge case. It is the statistical norm. After 53 factors compound this problem in ways that make the general population statistics look almost optimistic. First, the kidneys become less efficient at conserving potassium, meaning that even consistent intake may not translate into stable tissue levels the way it did at 35. Second, chronic conditions that become more prevalent in this age group, including type 2 diabetes, heart failure, and hypertension itself, alter the way the body regulates electrolyte balance, often making potassium harder to retain. Third, and perhaps most consequentially, the medications used to treat those conditions frequently accelerate potassium loss as a direct pharmacological effect. What makes this particularly difficult to detect is that serum potassium, the value that appears on a standard blood panel, reflects the potassium circulating in the blood, not the potassium stored in muscle tissue and cells, where the vast majority of the body's potassium actually resides. A person can have a serum potassium reading that falls within the normal laboratory range while their intracellular levels are substantially depleted. The test looks reassuring. The underlying reality is not. This disconnect between what the lab shows and what the body is actually experiencing is one of the more underappreciated gaps in routine health monitoring for adults over 50. The implications of that gap are not abstract. They show up in the gap between a blood pressure reading that seems controlled and the arterial stiffness that continues to develop underneath it. They show up in the bone density scan that declines year after year despite calcium supplementation. They show up in the muscle fatigue that limits activity, which limits cardiovascular conditioning, which raises risk in every direction simultaneously. And they will show up again, in much more specific terms, as this conversation moves forward. The banana became the symbol of potassium the way aspirin became the symbol of headache relief, through repetition, simplicity, and the human tendency to attach complex ideas to familiar objects. It is a useful association in the same way that a map is useful. Accurate enough to orient you, but not detailed enough to navigate by. The story of how bananas achieved this status is worth understanding because it reveals something important about how nutritional advice travels through culture and loses precision along the way. In the mid-20th century, as nutrition science was establishing its first widely communicated frameworks, bananas were among the most studied sources of potassium available in the American diet. They were accessible, affordable, consistent in composition, and easy to quantify. A banana was a banana. Researchers could reference it reliably, and the number, roughly 400 milligrams per medium fruit, became a fixed point in public health communication. What happened next was not deception. It was simplification. The message that potassium matters for blood pressure and cardiovascular health was accurate. The message that bananas contain potassium was accurate. The inference that most people drew, that bananas are therefore the go-to solution for potassium intake, was a logical leap that the data never actually supported, but that no one had a strong incentive to correct. The banana industry was not displeased. Public health communicators had a simple, visual, memorable answer to give, and so the association calcified. What the simplification left out is that bananas sit in the middle of the potassium density spectrum, not at the top. Per gram of food, bananas provide approximately 0.36 milligrams of potassium. That is a reasonable number. It is not a remarkable one. Dozens of foods, many of them far less famous in the context of potassium, deliver substantially more potassium per gram, per calorie, and per serving. Some deliver more than twice as much. One delivers more than 3 times as much, in a form that the body absorbs efficiently and that pairs naturally with the dietary patterns most associated with cardiovascular health in adults over 50. The persistence of the banana myth also reflects a subtler issue with how nutritional advice reaches people. The foods that become associated with specific nutrients tend to be the ones that were prominent in research literature at a particular moment in time, not necessarily the ones that perform best by current standards of analysis. Science moves. Cultural associations do not move at the same pace. The result that many people are optimizing around a decades-old snapshot of nutritional knowledge, while newer, better understood options sit unremarked on the same grocery store shelf. Understanding this is not about dismissing the banana. It is about recognizing that the question of how to meet potassium needs after 50 deserves a more current and more complete answer than the one that has been circulating since the 1950s. There is a food that provides more than twice the potassium of a banana, costs less per serving, sits on the same grocery store shelf, and has been quietly outperforming the icon for decades without anyone updating the conversation. What it is and why the body over 50 absorbs and uses it the way it does is where this goes next. The food is not exotic. It is not expensive. It does not require a specialty store or a nutritionist's guidance to find. In most American grocery stores, it sits within arm's reach of the produce section, often at a lower price per serving than the banana it outperforms by every relevant potassium metric. The food is the white potato, specifically a medium-baked potato with the skin on, and it contains approximately 925 milligrams of potassium per serving, which is more than twice the amount in a medium banana and roughly 27% of the daily adequate intake for men in a single serving. That number surprises most people. It surprised researchers, too, when systematic comparisons of potassium density across common foods began appearing in nutritional databases with enough consistency to challenge the received hierarchy. The potato had been largely absent from the potassium conversation, partly because of its association with processed forms that bear little nutritional resemblance to the whole food, and partly because the low-carbohydrate diet movement that dominated nutrition discourse for much of the early 2000s had repositioned potatoes as something to avoid rather than something to optimize around. Both associations are understandable. Neither reflects what a whole, unprocessed potato actually delivers. The potassium in a potato is primarily located in the flesh and the skin, with the skin contributing a meaningful portion of the total. This matters because potassium in whole foods arrives packaged with other compounds, fiber, vitamin C, vitamin B6, magnesium, that influence both how it is absorbed and how it functions once it enters the system. The Mayo Clinic has noted that dietary potassium from whole food sources tends to be more bioavailable and better tolerated by the kidneys than potassium from isolated supplements. In part because the food matrix moderates the rate of absorption and reduces the risk of transient hyperkalemia that can occur when potassium enters the bloodstream too rapidly. This distinction matters after 50 because the kidneys are operating with less reserve capacity than they were at younger ages, and a potassium source that delivers the mineral gradually, alongside fiber and water, is physiologically different from one that delivers it as a concentrated dose. There is also the question of resistant starch, a component that increases when a cooked potato is cooled before eating. Resistant starch is not digested in the small intestine. It passes into the large intestine, where it feeds beneficial gut bacteria and produces short-chain fatty acids that support the intestinal lining and modestly improve insulin sensitivity. A cooled potato eaten as part of a meal behaves very differently in the body than a freshly baked one eaten hot and plain. Not just in terms of blood sugar response, but in terms of the broader metabolic signal it sends. This is a practical detail, not a theoretical one, and it becomes relevant again when this conversation reaches preparation methods. What makes the potato the most relevant answer to the potassium question for adults over 50 is not any single number. It is the combination of quantity, bioavailability, cost, accessibility, and the degree to which it fits naturally into existing eating patterns without requiring significant behavioral change. It is already in most kitchens. The adjustment required is not adding something unfamiliar, it is understanding something familiar in a way that most people never have. The comparison between a banana and a baked potato with skin is not close. A medium banana delivers approximately 422 milligrams of potassium. A medium baked potato with skin delivers approximately 925 milligrams, more than twice as much in a single serving at roughly the same caloric cost. On a per-calorie basis, the potato is even more favorable, meaning that for someone managing overall caloric intake, it is the more efficient vehicle for meeting potassium needs. The numbers become more instructive when placed against daily adequate intake targets established by the National Institutes of Health. A single banana covers approximately 12 to 16% of the daily requirement, depending on sex. A single baked potato with skin covers approximately 20 to 27%. To meet the full daily requirement through bananas alone would require roughly 8 medium bananas, approximately 680 calories of fruit sugar. The efficiency gap between the two sources is not marginal. It is structural. What the raw numbers do not capture is the difference in nutritional context surrounding the potassium in each food. The banana delivers its potassium alongside simple sugars and modest fiber. The baked potato delivers it alongside complex carbohydrates, vitamin C, vitamin B6, iron, and magnesium. A mineral that works in close coordination with potassium to regulate muscle contraction and nerve signaling. According to Harvard Medical School, diets that provide adequate magnesium alongside potassium show stronger associations with blood pressure reduction than diets that address either mineral in isolation. The potato provides both in a single food. That combination matters in a way that the potassium number alone does not communicate. A food that delivers potassium alongside magnesium is not just providing two minerals simultaneously. It is providing two minerals that amplify each other's effects on the systems most at risk after 50. The arterial wall responds to both. The cardiac muscle depends on both. The bone tissue that loses density quietly over decades is influenced by both. Eating for potassium in isolation, without accounting for the nutritional environment surrounding it, is a partial strategy. The potato, eaten whole with its skin, is a more complete one. There is also the question of how each food fits into the broader dietary pattern associated with cardiovascular protection in this age group. The baked potato integrates naturally into meals built around protein, vegetables, and healthy fats, the combination that moderates its glycemic response and maximizes its mineral contribution. The banana, consumed as a standalone snack, delivers its potassium in a context that does not offer the same moderating effect. This is not an argument against fruit. It is an argument for understanding that how a food is eaten is as relevant as what the food contains, and that the potato, prepared and consumed thoughtfully, outperforms the banana by every measure that matters for health after 50. Potassium's relationship with blood pressure is one of the most consistently documented findings in cardiovascular nutrition research, and one of the least discussed in the average clinical encounter. The mechanism is not complicated, but it operates at a level of biological detail that rarely makes it into a 10-minute appointment. Understanding it changes how the recommendation to eat more potassium feels, less like generic advice and more like a specific intervention with a traceable physiological rationale. The starting point is sodium. Most people understand that high sodium intake is associated with elevated blood pressure, but fewer understand exactly why, and fewer still understand that potassium is the other side of that equation. The kidneys regulate blood pressure in part by controlling how much sodium is retained in the body. When sodium levels rise, the kidneys retain water to dilute the concentration, which increases blood volume, which increases the pressure the heart must generate to push that volume through the circulatory system. Potassium directly counteracts this process by signaling the kidneys to excrete more sodium, reducing fluid retention and allowing blood pressure to fall. The American Heart Association has stated that increasing potassium intake while moderating sodium intake produces blood pressure reductions comparable in magnitude to some first-line antihypertensive medications in certain populations. The effect is most pronounced in people who are already hypertensive, in those consuming high-sodium diets, and in adults over 50, the group in whom both arterial stiffness and sodium sensitivity tend to be most elevated. This is not a minor nutritional footnote. It is a direct therapeutic mechanism that operates every time potassium enters the bloodstream from a meal. Beyond fluid regulation, potassium influences blood pressure through a second pathway: its direct effect on the walls of blood vessels. The smooth muscle cells that line arteries contain potassium channels that, when properly activated, cause those cells to relax. A well-nourished arterial wall is a more flexible one, better able to expand and contract with each heartbeat, better able to accommodate changes in blood flow without generating spikes in pressure. When potassium is chronically low, those channels are less active, the arterial walls remain in a state of relative constriction, and resting blood pressure stays elevated even in the absence of other contributing factors. For most people over 50, that last sentence describes something they have already experienced: a blood pressure reading that keeps requiring adjustment despite reasonable effort, without a clear explanation for why the baseline keeps shifting. What this means practically is that the conversation about potassium and blood pressure is not just about diet as a background lifestyle factor. It is about a specific biological lever that can be moved with deliberate food choices. For someone whose blood pressure has been creeping upward over the past several years, a pattern so common after 50 that it is often described as inevitable, understanding this mechanism reframes what is possible. The arterial wall is not a fixed structure. It is a living tissue that responds to what it receives, contracting or relaxing based on the chemical environment surrounding it. And that environment, in terms of potassium, is largely determined by decisions made in the kitchen rather than the clinic. The implication is not that food replaces medication. It is that food is already doing pharmacology, and most people over 50 have never been told which direction theirs is working in. The heart is an electrical organ as much as it is a mechanical one. Every contraction begins as an electrical signal, a precisely timed cascade of ion movements across cell membranes that coordinates the chambers of the heart to fill and empty in the correct sequence, at the correct interval, without conscious effort. Potassium is central to that process. It is one of the primary ions responsible for repolarization, the phase of the cardiac cycle in which heart muscle cells reset after each contraction, preparing for the next beat. When potassium levels fall below the range the heart depends on, that reset becomes less reliable. The clinical term for what happens next is hypokalemia-induced arrhythmia, an irregular heartbeat caused or worsened by insufficient potassium. It ranges in severity from the occasional palpitation that feels like a skipped beat and resolves on its own, to sustained abnormalities in cardiac rhythm that increase the risk of atrial fibrillation, and, in more serious cases, ventricular arrhythmias. According to the American Heart Association, even mild to moderate reductions in serum potassium, levels that fall within or just below the low end of the normal laboratory range, are associated with measurable increases in arrhythmia risk, particularly in people who already have structural heart disease or who are taking certain cardiac medications. Beyond its role in cardiac electrical activity, potassium is essential to skeletal muscle function in ways that become increasingly relevant after 50. Muscle cells use potassium to generate the electrical gradient that enables contraction. When that gradient is compromised by low potassium, the result is weakness, cramping, and fatigue that is disproportionate to the level of physical effort involved. Many adults in this age group who experience persistent leg cramps, difficulty sustaining moderate physical activity, or a generalized sense of muscular heaviness have never had their potassium levels evaluated as a contributing factor. The symptoms are real. The connection is underappreciated. What happens next is the part of this conversation that deserves to be heard slowly. When skeletal muscle function is impaired by inadequate potassium, physical activity decreases. When physical activity decreases, cardiovascular conditioning declines. When cardiovascular conditioning declines, the heart works less efficiently at rest, and under exertion, blood pressure regulation becomes more difficult, and the risk profile for cardiovascular events rises across the board. Each step in that sequence is individually well documented. What is less often stated is that they form a single continuous loop, one that can be entered at the most unremarkable point imaginable. A recurring cramp that someone attributes to dehydration and moves on from without further investigation. The entry point is that small. The downstream consequence over months and years is not. The practical implication is straightforward. A body over 50 that is running low on potassium is not just running low on a mineral. It is operating with a compromised electrical system, reduced muscular capacity, and a cardiovascular risk profile that is higher than it needs to be, often without any single symptom dramatic enough to prompt investigation. Addressing the deficit does not require a prescription. It requires understanding what the body is asking for and knowing which foods deliver it most effectively. There is a nuance in the potassium conversation that most health content skips entirely, not because it is complicated, but because it requires making a distinction that takes more than one sentence to explain. That distinction involves the kidneys, and understanding it is what separates genuinely useful guidance from the kind that sounds complete but leaves a meaningful subset of people worse off for having followed it. Healthy kidneys regulate potassium with remarkable precision. When intake rises, they excrete the excess. When intake falls, they conserve what remains. This regulatory capacity is why potassium toxicity from food sources is essentially impossible in people with normal kidney function. The kidneys simply remove what the body does not need. For the large majority of adults over 50, this means that increasing whole food potassium intake is not only safe, but actively protective. Adequate potassium reduces kidney stone formation, particularly calcium oxalate stones, which are the most common type in this age group. According to the Mayo Clinic, dietary potassium reduces urinary calcium excretion, which decreases the concentration of calcium available to crystallize. A direct mechanism with direct clinical relevance for anyone who has ever passed a stone or been told they are at risk for one. The asterisk belongs here. The National Institute of Diabetes, Digestive, and Kidney Diseases estimates that chronic kidney disease affects approximately 15% of American adults, and that the majority are unaware of it because early-stage disease produces no symptoms and does not appear on standard health panels unless specific markers are tested. When kidney function is meaningfully reduced, the calculus around potassium shifts. A kidney operating at diminished capacity may not excrete potassium efficiently, which means that high intake, particularly from concentrated supplements, can push serum levels into ranges that affect cardiac rhythm. This is not a reason to avoid potassium-rich foods. It is a reason to know where your kidney function stands before making significant changes. Something a simple blood test can clarify in a single appointment. For everyone else, the majority for whom kidney function is normal or near normal, the guidance runs in the direction this entire conversation has been building toward. More whole food potassium, consistent intake across meals, an understanding of which sources deliver the mineral most effectively and which preparation methods preserve it best. The kidney nuance is real, and it belongs in this conversation. But it is a qualification at the margin, not a reason to hesitate at the center. The body that is absorbing potassium well from food across years, that body is doing something measurably different with its cardiovascular risk, its bone density, and its long-term trajectory than the one that settled for the banana and called it done. Bone health rarely enters the potassium conversation, and that absence is one of the more significant gaps in how most people over 50 think about this mineral. The connection between potassium and bone density is not intuitive. Calcium gets the attention. Vitamin D gets the secondary discussion. Potassium, if it appears at all, is mentioned in the context of blood pressure and muscle function, and then left there. But the research linking potassium intake to bone preservation in aging adults is substantial enough to deserve its own space in this conversation. The mechanism runs through acid-base balance. The kidneys work continuously to maintain the blood at a slightly alkaline pH, and when the diet generates excess acid, which processed foods, high animal protein intake, and low vegetable consumption tend to do, the body draws on alkaline compounds stored in bone tissue to neutralize it. Over time, this process contributes to bone mineral loss. Potassium, particularly in the forms found in fruits and vegetables, generates alkaline metabolites during digestion that reduce the acid load the kidneys must manage. Less acid burden means less demand on bone reserves, which means better preservation of bone density over years and decades. The Nurses' Health Study, one of the longest-running nutritional investigations in American medical research, found that women with higher dietary potassium intake had significantly greater bone mineral density than those with lower intake, independent of calcium consumption. This finding has been replicated in multiple subsequent studies across both sexes, though the effect is particularly pronounced in postmenopausal women, the group already facing accelerated bone loss from declining estrogen levels. For that population, potassium-rich eating represents a meaningful and underutilized protective factor. The relationship between potassium and bone also connects to magnesium and vitamin D in ways that reinforce each other. Magnesium is required for the activation of vitamin D, which in turn regulates calcium absorption. Potassium supports the cellular environment in which these processes operate. When all three are present in adequate amounts, the skeletal system has the full complement of inputs it needs to maintain density and structural integrity. When any one of them is chronically low, as is common in adults over 50 consuming typical American diets, the system compensates at a cost that accumulates silently over years before appearing on a bone density scan. There is also a direct medication interaction worth understanding. Several drugs commonly prescribed in this age group affect bone metabolism through potassium-related pathways. Thiazide diuretics, frequently used for hypertension, reduce urinary calcium excretion and modestly protect bone density, but they simultaneously increase potassium excretion, which can undermine the alkalizing effect that makes potassium protective in the first place. Proton pump inhibitors, used widely for acid reflux, impair magnesium absorption over time, which disrupts the vitamin D and calcium cascade that depends on adequate magnesium. Understanding these interactions does not require stopping any medication. It requires knowing that the nutritional environment surrounding those medications either supports or undermines their intended effects, and that potassium is a more central player in that environment than most prescriptions acknowledge. There is a question that comes up reliably in any serious conversation about potassium and diet, and it deserves a direct answer before this conversation moves forward. The question is not whether to eat more potassium-rich foods. At this point, the case for that is clear. The question is how to do it in a way that actually works within the eating patterns most people over 50 already have, without requiring the kind of wholesale dietary restructuring that sounds reasonable in theory and collapses within 2 weeks in practice. The white potato, established earlier as the single most potassium-dense commonly available food, is also one of the most versatile, and the way it is prepared determines how the body responds to it in ways that go beyond potassium alone. A medium potato baked with its skin intact and eaten as part of a meal alongside protein and a source of fat produces a considerably lower glycemic response than the same potato eaten hot and plain. The skin is not incidental. It contributes a meaningful portion of the total potassium and provides fiber that moderates absorption of everything consumed alongside it. Removing the skin before eating is one of the most common ways people inadvertently reduce the nutritional value of a food they are already eating. Cooling a cooked potato for several hours before eating it or consuming it the following day increases its resistant starch content significantly. Resistant starch behaves differently in the body than regular starch. It passes through the small intestine undigested and reaches the large intestine, where it feeds beneficial gut bacteria and produces short-chain fatty acids that support the intestinal lining and improve insulin sensitivity over time. The potassium content remains intact through cooling. What changes is the metabolic profile of the meal, in a direction that is favorable for blood sugar regulation, gut health, and the broader inflammatory environment that influences cardiovascular risk after 50. A potato eaten cold as part of a composed salad or reheated gently after overnight refrigeration is a meaningfully different food metabolically than one eaten fresh from the oven. Frequency matters as much as method. A single high-potassium meal does not move the needle on tissue potassium levels in any lasting way. What moves the needle is consistent intake across multiple meals per week, the mineral delivered repeatedly in whole food form over weeks and months. This means building 1 or 2 potassium anchor foods into the regular meal rotation rather than treating high potassium eating as an occasional intervention. The potato is the most practical anchor for most households. Legumes, white beans, lentils, chickpeas are the second tier, and they integrate into soups, stews, and sides that already exist in most cooking repertoires without requiring new techniques or unfamiliar ingredients. Cooked leafy greens round out the rotation, concentrating their mineral content when wilted in a way that makes a small addition to an existing meal genuinely significant. What determines whether any of this actually translates into stable potassium status, however, is not just what someone eats. It is what their medications are doing to the mineral at the same time. And that part of the conversation has not been addressed yet. The potato is the most potassium-dense, commonly available whole food in the American diet. But it is not the only one that deserves attention. Different sources deliver potassium alongside different complementary nutrients, and rotating among them produces results that a single food cannot replicate on its own. Cooked white beans deliver approximately 1,000 milligrams of potassium per half cup, more than the potato, in a smaller volume, with substantial fiber and plant protein that moderates blood sugar response and supports satiety. For someone who has historically avoided legumes because of digestive discomfort, the solution is gradual introduction rather than elimination. Smaller portions over several weeks as the gut microbiome adapts. The discomfort is temporary. The potassium is not going anywhere. Lentils deliver approximately 730 milligrams per cup cooked, require no soaking, and cook in under 30 minutes, making them one of the most practical high-potassium foods available. Black beans and chickpeas fall in the 400 to 500 milligram range per half cup cooked, consistently above the banana, inexpensive and familiar enough to fit into existing meal patterns without significant behavioral adjustment. Avocado delivers approximately 690 milligrams per half fruit alongside monounsaturated fat that supports cardiovascular health and enhances absorption of fat-soluble nutrients in the same meal. Sweet potato delivers approximately 540 milligrams per medium serving, higher in beta-carotene than the white potato, with a glycemic response that varies based on preparation and meal context. Cooked spinach, Swiss chard, and beet greens concentrate potassium significantly when heat reduces their volume. The mineral content of a full cup of raw spinach survives intact in the few tablespoons that remain after wilting. The pattern is consistent. The highest potassium densities in the food supply appear in vegetables and legumes, not in fruit. The banana was never the top of that list. It was simply the most visible entry point into a conversation that the data always pointed further. Closing the gap does not require dramatic change. It requires understanding where potassium actually lives in the modern food supply and making room for those sources with enough consistency to matter. If this conversation has shifted something in how you think about what is already in your kitchen, share it with someone who is still eating a banana and calling it done. Subscribe if you want more of this. And stay close, because what comes next is the piece that determines whether everything discussed so far actually applies to you, or whether your medications are already changing the equation in ways you have never been told about. Potassium levels in the body do not exist in isolation from the medication surrounding them. For adults over 50, a population in which the simultaneous use of multiple prescription drugs is the norm rather than the exception. The pharmacological environment is one of the most consequential and least discussed factors shaping mineral status. Before this conversation closes, that environment deserves a direct look. Some of the most widely prescribed medications in this age group accelerate potassium loss as a direct pharmacological effect. Thiazide diuretics, used primarily for hypertension, increase urinary sodium excretion to reduce fluid volume, but potassium follows sodium through the same renal pathway, and the loss accumulates quietly over months of continuous use. Loop diuretics produce an even more pronounced depletion effect. What is less consistently communicated in either case is that a patient consuming adequate whole food potassium is starting from a meaningfully different baseline, and the dietary context surrounding these medications significantly influences how much pharmacological correction is actually needed. Others work in the opposite direction entirely. ACE inhibitors and angiotensin receptor blockers, two drug classes widely used for hypertension and cardiovascular protection, reduce potassium excretion by blocking hormonal pathways that would otherwise signal the kidneys to release it. In someone already consuming high dietary potassium or taking supplements, they can push serum levels upward rather than downward. Metformin does not affect potassium directly, but impairs vitamin B12 absorption over time in ways that connect to the magnesium and nervous system pathways that interact with potassium regulation. The principle running through both directions is the same. The nutritional environment surrounding a medication either cushions its effects or amplifies them, and most prescriptions are written without that context ever entering the conversation. Potassium is not a supplement story. The benefits documented across cardiovascular health, bone density, kidney function, and blood pressure were observed in populations eating whole foods, not taking capsules. Food delivers the mineral gradually, embedded in fiber, water, and complementary nutrients that moderate absorption and interact with the systems that use it most directly. A baked potato, a cup of cooked spinach, a serving of white beans. These are not just delivery mechanisms. They are the form in which the research consistently shows potassium working. The work does not happen at the pharmacy. It happens in the kitchen, at the table, in the small repeatable decisions that compound over months into outcomes that no single prescription could have produced alone. According to The Lancet, dietary risk factors account for a larger share of preventable cardiovascular deaths globally than any other modifiable factor, including smoking. That finding rarely makes headlines, but it reflects something this entire conversation has been pointing toward. The most powerful tools available for protecting health after 50 do not require a prescription. They require understanding and the willingness to act on it at the level of ordinary daily life. If this conversation changed something in how you think about what is already in your kitchen, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe if you want more of this. Leave a comment telling us what you want examined next. See you in the next one.